Good evening and welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, and with me tonight is Brent Holman-Gomez, also with the Gay Liberation Network. And as you saw on your screen a few moments ago, we're going to be talking about 50 years since the first gay rights protest. Many people think that that first protest happened in Philadelphia, and certainly that's where many of the early protests happened, but just a few months before that, 50 years ago, it happened in D.C., and Brent has done a bit of research on this, and we're going to be talking about some of the themes that came up, as well as some of the specific history, how we came from these very, very small demonstrations, mainly in Philadelphia, to the day where we were getting hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions into the streets for gay rights demonstrations, and ultimately winning many of the formal legal requirements of equal citizenship that we've won, for example, here in Illinois, and of course the recent Supreme Court equal marriage rights decision. But Brent, could you tell our viewers a little bit about how all this started in the 1960s?
Yeah, the environment at the time in 1964, there had been some isolated protests about police brutality, about the military's treatment of a few individual people on LGBT, mostly homosexual grounds. However, in April of 1965, we saw the first publicly called protest that was, promoted, to a larger audience, at the White House in D.C. And a group of about 16 people were there, and from that group, Craig Rodwell made a call to say, this is something that really is about the Declaration of Independence of this country, and what the Constitution stands for, and the fact that it is not covering our homosexual people. And so he called for an Independence Day at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, a annual reminder is what it became called, to remind people of the fact that the Declaration of Independence calls for all men to be created equal and to be able to pursue happiness, and that should include all people, including homosexuals at the time.
Well, and I think it's important to have give a little bit of context about how this started, because it wasn't like the gay rights movement, such as it was, birthed itself anew in 1965. That actually there was the first gay rights organization in the United States, started in the early 20s, was rapidly crushed by the police, but then the first sustained gay rights organization started around 1950. It was actually formed by former members of the Communist Party who had been radicalized by their experience in that organization, decided, well, we've been fighting for other people's rights, we need to fight for our own rights as well. Some of them were expelled from the Communist Party for that, but they were organizing. The early organization, the Mattachine Society, was a very radical organization, but in context of the times, those folks were purged from the organization by, frankly, anti-leftist forces, anti-communist forces, and things rapidly devolved in a negative direction for the organization. It became very small and almost non-existent. There were a few publications around, but then in the context of the burgeoning civil rights movement for African Americans, the beginnings of an anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, that I think is when people like Craig Rodwell were looking around them and said, we need to do more than meet in private places and not talk to the public. And it was very bold.
Right. Yeah, no, it was this like 9 months that led up to these annual reminders that started in 1965 were the first times that you saw any public protest of people willing to get out and say, I am a homosexual and I am demanding my rights. And so it was it was not the first time that people had done. In 1959 there had been an action in Los Angeles. Mattachine Society actually started out by Los Angeles, which is the society that Andy was referring to. And the environment was so hostile, compared to what we think of right now, that they called themselves homophiles, and it was the homophile movement. A lot of their concepts were around being presentable and employable people. The kind of efforts that these organizations, which were national in scale, they in the major cities they had different chapters. The efforts that they had were around, the discrimination in employment that the government and the military were doing. And so out of that birthed here these first, organized protests, and these are the pictures of the annual reminder that started on Independence Day in 1965 in Philadelphia, in front of Independence Hall. And as you, sorry, go ahead.
And we were only talking about a couple dozen people at the first one. That's right.
There were 39 people at this first one. And the reason why it's particularly so significant is because it was July 4th of 1965, and then they did it again in 1966, and in 1967, and 68. And then in 1969, the Stonewall riots occurred in New York.
Now there's going to be an exhibit going on through early 2016. Could you say a few words about this, Brent?
Yeah. So in Philadelphia, there is an exhibit at the National Constitution Center, a state park there, or a national park. It is across the street from the Independence Hall. You saw on your screen earlier a plaque, a historical reminder plaque about the actions that took place there as being some of the earliest gay rights organizing that occurred. And this exhibit, is, as you can see on your screen here, is talking about the Constitution, gay rights, and the Supreme Court. It's covering a variety of elements, as well as some that we'll get into later in the program here. But it's, in this society, we've come a long way to have, a national a national park doing an exhibit expressly on LGBT history. And really, the dramatic thing about this is that most people don't know about this annual reminder in Philadelphia, and yet it is the prequel to what we now know as the Pride Day celebrations. So I was going to say, many of the people that came to these annual reminders were from New York, actually, and they would rent a bus and they would come down to Philadelphia. So in 1969, when the Stonewall riots occurred, they occurred at the end of June, a week before the annual reminder was scheduled to occur. And because of the 3 days of riots that had gone on in New York, there was a lot of the police were harassing Craig Rodwell and the other folks that organized this protest in Philadelphia to not make this trip down there to Philadelphia. They did, so they continued to do it that year, and so the last annual reminder was in 1969, a week after Stonewall. In the fall of that year, Craig Rodwell, the original initiator of the annual reminder, voiced support for, wanted to change the demonstration to be a demonstration to commemorate the riot that occurred at Stonewall. And so the fact that there was already an apparatus of, the idea of an annual thing happening, it basically moved to New York. It became called the Christopher Street Liberation March, which is what we now call the Pride March. And so this was the earliest, the prequel to our Pride marches.
Well, it's very important to note that you saw in those photographs that we had up on the screen a few moments ago, the people were not having their faces masked. They were out there in public, and this was at a time when people very typically would lose their jobs. They'd be expelled from their housing. They'd become estranged from their families if it came out that they were gay, especially if it came out publicly. And here in Chicago, then Mayor Richard J. Daley his administration regularly raided gay bars, and the Chicago Tribune and other local newspapers would faithfully print the names of people that have been arrested. These were for misdemeanors. This would be like you caught speeding, and yet the local newspaper decides to print your name, your address, your employer if they could find it out, basically to make life as miserable as possible. And lots of people lost their jobs. They lost what careers they had. And so for these few dozens of people to be doing this right in public in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia was a very courageous action. Now, moving things forward, with the advent of the Stonewall Rebellion, it wasn't like ideas stopped fulminating and history stopped. You had, with the Stonewall Rebellion, a lot of people who did the organizing after that had been direct participants in the African American Civil Rights Movement as well as the anti-war movement, and they brought a whole new set of radical ideas. Could you say a few things about that, Brent?
Yeah, I mean, the over the next couple of years, the homophile organizations, Mattachine and Echo was another one on the East Coast that was a coalition. They more or less, come out, lose the limelight as being the homosexual organizations, and groups such as Gay Liberation Front and Gay Action Alliance, other groups,
yeah.
other groups that I don't have in mind right now, really come more to the forefront as with a more radical vision of inclusion for all, leaving behind this idea that as we saw in the pictures, and I'd like to maybe go back later on, everyone is dressed in suits and very professionally, and moving into more of this, 1970s, late 1960s, youth movement of free love and freedom of expression, including in your dress. As opposed to trying to conform to traditional roles in society.
Well, and you look to movements today, it's very interesting. You have a situation where, with the Black Lives Matters protests, where the new organizations in this city and around the country are eclipsing the old standard civil rights organizations. We saw that a generation ago with the old so-called homophile organizations, which had the apparatus, they had the personnel, they had the access to their own press and so forth, and yet the youthful energy of the new organizations basically within a few months' time totally eclipsed those organizations. Those organizations didn't go completely by the wayside, but they were not seen as the vanguard. And you look at events in Ferguson, followed by events in New York and around the country, you see a similar pattern of the youth leading the way, whereas the elders were stuck in first gear, and we see this in movement. So there are things to be learned from this movement history, not just for LGBTs, but I think for others fighting for justice as well.
Yeah. So if you wouldn't mind maybe going back and showing some of these pictures, there's some famous activists from the time that were actually showed up to the very first ones. Here on this first one is Barbara Giddings. I think this is 1966, actually. Might be the first one, 1965. But Barbara Giddings, Frank Kameny, who was a big crusader with legal efforts. He was also at the first one, and I think came to many of the other events. But the number of people that you see at these events, there was 39 at the first one. At the very last one, after Stonewall, 45 people came. So these are not big events, and yet the power that they had and the way that they that they were able to continue doing it year after year and building on that has now resulted into we had 1 million people at Pride this year. And especially this was at a time when if you saw an interview with a homosexual on television, that homosexual would be blacked out. You would not be able to make out the figures of their face.
Yeah.
Their voice would probably be distorted, so as to protect their identity, to protect their confidentiality, because of all the things that Andy was saying about the way that society launched smear campaigns to ruin these people's these people's lives. And so that's the environment that we were coming out of. And yet throughout the 50 years since, much of the gains in our society have been through small street protests of 40 people, which doesn't look like a lot of people out on a street in a city. I've been there. I've been one of those. We all know.
One of the 40.
But they do matter. They build on each other, off of each other. They and they can have the ability to really change society, particularly when in situations like this where you are taking back the silence. People who could not say their name and their identity are coming out and saying, I am this person, and I am a homosexual.
Well, and I think you hit on a very important point there, the whole issue of coming out, which has been interpreted in different ways. Coming out, do I admit to myself that I'm LGBT? Do I admit to other LGBTs that I am? Or do I admit to my family? Do I admit to my coworkers, employer? I mean, there's different levels of this, and it was such a bold act to say, I'm not, because there was a subculture going right back to the early part of the 20th century and arguably back into the late 19th century in big cities like New York, where people who we call today LGBTs knew each other. They knew each other's names, at least their first names, but it was all very insular. And it was all subject to being uncovered by the police in their various raids, including here in Chicago. Every major city had these. And the bold move of coming out onto the streets of Philadelphia, albeit in small numbers, in many respects paved the way for Stonewall, which led to many, many thousands, tens of thousands coming out initially. And then as the movement spread, and it did go through ups and downs. It's important to note that particularly after a few years in the early 1970s, the movement had almost withered on the vine, including places like here in Chicago. And it was then revived by attacks by Anita Bryant and other anti-gay bigots that led to explosion. Here in Chicago, I was just conversing online with an early activist, Jeff Gralbert, who spoke of the visit of Anita Bryant to the city of Chicago after the Pride Parade here had nearly died. In Los Angeles, the second biggest city in the country, they'd skipped a year because there's not interest. But then when Anita Bryant came to Chicago, I believe it was in 1979, and she announced she was coming to the Medina Temple, literally some 5,000 people surrounded the Medina Temple where she was giving some sort of concert. Hardly anyone attended the concert. But at that time, for a few weeks' time, Chicago had hosted the largest gay rights demonstration ever in world history. It was eclipsed just a week or so later, I believe, in Dallas, where they got a larger crowd. But it's important to note that movements don't just go in a fine, even way upwards. And this is one of the myths about the African American civil rights movement, which I think is particularly damaging, because when activists hit a speed bump and things aren't going their way, they say, well, why can't we keep our act together? Previous movements just went onwards and ever upwards. The reality is that the early LGBT rights movement ran into some very severe difficulties in the early 70s, was revived thanks to the efforts of the anti-gay right. And then we hit another huge setback with the onset of AIDS. And so we've had this to and fro, and arguably right now we face a huge danger of our movement dwindling down to next to nothing because we've won marriage equality. And while so many people have said there's so many more things that we need to win, we need national equal employment rights, we need national equal housing rights, we need national equal access to public accommodations. Nonetheless, a lot of organizations, I think, right now are winding down, maybe closing up shop. Maybe they're just going into quiescence for a while. But it's important to keep these things going.
Right. On the point of these movements constantly, or not constantly, but regularly get new life put into them. The Black Lives Matter efforts, basically you are taking an arrestee, a black youth arrestee that is generally what has caused these these efforts to
switching
happen
lanes
across.
without using a turn signal. Gosh, how many times have white people done that?
Right. But people, without a voice, basically, you don't expect to hear from an arrestee complaining about the way that the police have treated them. Mm-hmm. And yet, this movement is giving that person a voice, mm-hmm. just like these marches in Philadelphia mm-hmm. did for homophiles at the time.
And raising awareness about the issues, not just amongst African Americans or in our case LGBTs, but there was a poll that just was out today in today's Tribune. We're talking here in August 2015. I know this is on tape. A poll showing that actually a majority of white people, in whatever convoluted way, think that there has been a big increase in racial problems or racist issues. Now, they may not think about the way that we might and people involved in the Black Lives Matters protest, but it has sparked a conversation about all these deaths of black people in police custody, and that's a welcome development, and that's what the gay rights movement did back in the day in its own and different way, but it sparked a conversation not just amongst LGBTs and gave us confidence, our predecessors, to get out into the streets and to demand more, but it also provoked a conversation even amongst bigots.
Right. And so the way that I see this annual reminder being present with us today, or what we can learn from it today, is what are the silent people within the LGBT community, but also within the population at large that need to be getting a voice. I mean, our gay people, LGBT people are have a big homeless youth problem. Mm-hmm. It is still pretty socially acceptable in many parts of this country for parents to kick out their children because they are LGBT.
And what is it? 1/4 of homeless identify as LGBT, which is way out of proportion to the.
I think actually even among youth homeless, yeah. I think the number's 40%, mm-hmm. which is a striking,
way out of proportion, right. Yeah.
That is a group of people who generally have not had their voices heard. We have not spoken out about our homeless, our difficulties with housing, particularly as youth. Mm-hmm. Just the other night on television, I saw one of those horrible images of a man being interviewed where you could not see his face and his voice was distorted by the television, and this was an undocumented immigrant. Mm-hmm. Who wanted to? He did not feel comfortable telling his story, which I think was about employment, problems he was having with his employer, and giving up his identity. And LGBTs are, we are immigrants. We are increasingly immigrants in this country as this society becomes a little warmer to LGBT people. People are moving to this country specifically for that reason from mm-hmm. other places. And so we need to be working lockstep with those people. That's what the memory of the annual reminder can teach us, is that we need to be with all of those people that can't show their face mm-hmm. on television because of fear.
Well, and those who do come out, again, this is coming out is not a silver bullet, and some people face far more difficult circumstances than others. People who would become homeless if their parents found out that they were LGBT, and so I don't think it's a moral obligation to come out. But the fact is that you cannot effectively organize for your rights if everyone is in the closet, and the more people who do come out, it makes it easier for those who, for whatever reason, are still in the closet. Now, I think there's a big difference between a youth who risks becoming homeless and some jerk congressperson who is in the closet simply because they want to further their career. But the closet still is a huge problem for many people, particularly at a time of record youth unemployment, where coming out to your parents means that you're without housing. You've got no reasonable means of achieving housing. So while we've won marriage equality in this country, and despite efforts to chip away at that right in terms of public accommodations access, there is so much more that needs to be done. And these annual reminder demonstrations for the Philadelphia folks were a critical role in building towards Stonewall. Stonewall did not arise out of a vacuum. It arose out of the civil rights movement and that sort of fight back, but also it got a crucial push from the people who were involved, some of those who made the transition from the old homophile movement to the radical gay liberation movement. They played a critical role in keeping the movement alive, so that when there were the big explosions, there were activists on the ground ready to build new organizations if need be, but who knew something about organizing before the big explosions occurred. So we're getting towards the end of our show here, Brent. Do you have a few closing thoughts about what's the most important thing to be thinking about now on the 50th anniversary of the first gay rights protest in the world?
Public protest does bring about change. Small groups of people, 40 folks that regularly got out, can do it and aren't to be laughed at. And and just a reminder that their push was that the things cited in our Constitution should be pushed to be sure that they are inclusive of all, even those without a voice.
And once again, we've got this national exhibit happening in Philadelphia through early January 2016. A few brief words about this, Brent?
Yeah, Bob and I from Gay Liberation Network are planning a trip out there. We've got someone formerly with Gay Liberation Network lives there, and we're going to see this exhibit, but it's on through January 3rd if you're in Philadelphia. Anytime over the next few months, and you might make a special trip for it. It's going to cover things including immigration and as well as other decisions on the right to privacy and various things that the Supreme Court has decided.
Okay, and with that, we close out tonight's show, and thank you for watching the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television.